You have a question? I'm just messing with you. I'm just trying to get this out. I wasn't trying to embarrass you. All right. Well, we do not have the mics this morning. We had a little bit of a problem with the crackling. Can you guys hear me way in the back? All right, good. So we had a problem with the mics crackling, so we're not going to use them. So if you do have questions or a question, if you could repeat it and then help me by trying to get me to repeat your question so that they can hear online, and so then we can all benefit from that, okay? One of the things I wanted to say, and I know there's not, the pastors are busy, so I'll just say it anyway. I do appreciate them allowing me the liberty to do this. This is a difficult study for a lot of you, I know, and probably some will not listen to it. But again, I think if you will just listen, you'll learn. I'm not trying to change your mind on your position, but I'm trying to get you to learn and think about what you're believing and why. And so that's what we're going to look at tonight. If you want to look online is our outline. I have our outline, and for now, we will be able to use that until until Satan gets in the system or something that messes everything up and it stops working. But for now, we're going to do it like this. So just as a heads up, let me again call to your attention just a couple things for your information so that you understand. There are various perspectives when you're studying the Bible, okay? The perspective, and I'll go over this again, it's in our outline, but just again, as a point of reference to help you understand how we're studying, what we're looking at, I am looking at what we call the dispensational, pre-tribulational, premillennial viewpoint. And again, I'll give you other proponents, other people who believe this so that you can see their names and you won't think, man, that guy's a heretic up there. What's he talking about? So this is the dispensational perspective. You have the Old Testament Jews, the Old Testament economy. God had created them. He had chosen and called them. This is part of our outline on Israelology. He covenanted with them. And last time we talked about the Noahic covenant, and then we got into the Abrahamic covenant, after which time God forms the church out of Jew and Gentile and makes one new man. That one new man then is one day what we call, we use the Latin term rapture, the Greek term harpazo, means to snatch out. At one point in history, in Ephesians chapter 2, and I realize you can't see that real clearly, at one point, God is going to snatch out his church, John 14, 1 Thessalonians 4, and 1 Corinthians 15, after which time there may be a sort of distinct period. I don't know how long, but I don't think it's going to happen the next day, after which time God will turn back and start dealing primarily with his Jewish people again. That will bring them into several areas that no one really likes to talk about, but I want to bring to your attention so that you understand this, and it's this, the tribulation. This is a huge area, a huge topic in Bible eschatology that no one touches. Also, the wrath of God, which is repeated over and over again in the Old Testament and in the New Testament, when God is pouring out his wrath. There's a six-nation war in Ezekiel 38 and 39 when Israel is dwelling in peace. There are supernatural signs that God brings about to destroy several people that are coming against them. After which time you have a 75-day gap in Daniel chapter 12, verses 11 and 12. And I'll bring out again, there are certain events that are going to happen during that time gap period. After which time Christ brings in, and this is the subject we're talking about, his messianic kingdom, the 1,000-year reign of Christ, the theocratic kingdom. And again, we'll mention all these again. And then after that, you go into what we call eternity or the eternal state. Now, just a couple, and I won't mention their names, but you can look at them later. The other two subjects that deal with that, now these all are usually thought of as figurative. But then when you get down to the Messianic temple, and again, the Messianic temple, there's more information on that than the Ark and Solomon's temple. Messianic temple, which covers like The 6 chapters is usually spiritualized. Again, it's not taken literal. But even in that Messianic temple they believe in a literal kingdom. So you have a literal kingdom, but a non-literal temple. You see what I'm saying? So you're going back and forth. Some stuff you're spiritualizing, some stuff you're taking as literal. Okay? Now, when you go down to another group, just for your, again, information so that you know what we're talking about, and the section that I want you to understand is that when you're talking about whether it's the historic premillennialism, covenant theology, which includes amillennialism, postmillennialism, and those subjects, the church is the fullness. In other words, there is no turning back, as this top section says. There is no rapture, there is no turning back, there is no 70th week and all that sort of thing. When you get down to here, the purpose that God has for Israel is going to find its completion in the church. God's not going to rapture out the church and then go back to Israel. The church finds its fulfillment in this area in which we live, which means the next thing to happen is not a harpazo here, but they put the harpazo here when Christ comes his second time. Now, the people who would believe that are pretty much everybody else. The church has replaced Israel. This is the main difference. Is there a literal national restoration, conversion of Israel, or does Israel find its fulfillment now in the church? And we'll see that in all these people, historic premillennialism, which many of the leaders are, postmillennial, amillennial, all of those groups, again, say that Israel and the church are one and the same. There is no future for Israel outside of the church. Is everybody with me so far? Yeah? Kinda, in a way? Now, I say that because of this. Usually, there's always arguments with people who are talking about eschatology, and I put that down there. The intensity that follows these eschatological discussions reveals its essential nature. I mean, I know people say you can get to heaven whether you are amillennial, postmillennial, premillennial, and I believe that, but I also believe there's a right and a wrong answer. And you need to know the right answer. So, here's what I want you to get from what I just said. There is a right and a wrong answer. It's for you to find. Okay? I'm not trying to tell you my answer is the right one, but that's just for your information and for your benefit. Okay? Now, if you want to look at your outline, and again, this will be online, or it's right here, and so we'll look at it. And so we want to look at the position of the promised land, the proponents, or those who believe this teaching, the promised land itself, the place of the promised land, the prophet's description of the promised land, and then that preparation for the promised land. So the position of the promised land, and this may be a little bit difficult, but in our CMA statement of faith, and again, I understand this, not everybody believes this, that's fine. But in our statement of faith, the second coming of Jesus is imminent. Now, who knows what the word imminent means? It means immediate, it means next. So for me, when I'm teaching this, when I'm studying this, and it talks about that the second return of Christ is imminent, I think of something different. I'm not thinking of his return to earth. I'm thinking of his imminent return. That means it is the next definite event that's to take place. I'm not looking for the tribulation. I'm not looking for the Antichrist. I'm not looking for the wrath of God. I'm looking for Jesus. Right? So if you want to get on board with me, come on. I'm kidding. If you're not pre, don't get mad at me. That was a joke. I won't do it again. I won't do it again. So in our statement of faith, when we're signing our statement of faith, we say that the second coming of Christ is imminent. It's the next thing to happen, and it will be personal, visible, and premillennial. Now, not everybody believes that. Not everybody agrees with that, and that's fine. But that is the statement of faith, that you believe that it will be a premillennial return, and this is the believer's blessed hope. It's the vital truth, which is an incentive to holy living and faithful service. If the next thing to happen is Christ's return, well, then just think about it. Some of the proponents of this view, I lost it there. All right. Some of the proponents of this view are the people who teach this view, and I did this so that you would say, nobody believes this but you, right? C.I. Scofield believed this view. Louis Ferry Schaefer, the founder of what is it? Was it Dallas? Dallas, yes. He worked at, yeah. Who's Andy Wood, the Schaefer Theological Seminary? That's what I was thinking of. You have Louis Ferry Schaefer, you have John Wolford, Charles Ryrie, Dwight Pentecost, Thomas Ice, John MacArthur, David Jeremiah, Andy Woods, and many other people. If you read these people, listen to these people, these are people who believe the same thing that I'm teaching you right now, the same philosophy. If you're looking and reading after a Reformed position, you're not going to get this because the church and Israel are the same. There is no future for Israel outside of their position in the church, okay? And so that's what we want to look at. Everybody with me so far? All right. So if you want to look at some of these outlines, the promised land, and I'll just give you several passages. What did I do? I lost my Bible. There we go. If you want to look at your outline or just follow along with me, the promised land. Now, the enjoyment of this land is conditioned upon obedience. And this is going to be tricky because this one is tied in with the Mosaic covenant. And I'll get to that when we get to that. But if you look down at the bottom there, the unconditional covenant with a conditional blessing. Now, what do you mean an unconditional covenant? Remember, when we talked about the Abrahamic covenant, Abraham was promised land, seed, and blessing. That's what he was promised. God vowed himself to fulfill the obligations to bring these things to pass. So it's unconditional in the sense that God is going to bring it to pass. But it is conditional on their enjoying that land, that they are completely obedient. See that? So that throws everybody off at first. Right? Any thoughts so far on that? All right, so the enjoyment of this land is conditioned, even though upon their obedience, and their ownership of this land is unconditioned. And of course, the reason is because God has vowed himself to meet the needs of this obligation. You can see it in Hebrews chapter 6 and verse 13, where it says, "For when God made a promise to Abraham, because he could swear by no greater, he swore by himself." So here is God promising, he's swearing, he's covenanting, he's making an oath to give them these land. Remember, you have the Abrahamic covenant, and from that Abrahamic covenant, when you look out throughout the rest of the Bible, comes these covenants. And then they all find their consummation in the Messianic kingdom. Okay? So, looking at this, it's called the good land. Genesis chapter 15, verses 18 through 21, and Joshua 1:4 give you the boundaries of it. Let me see if I can't give you just a couple passages on the outline that we have. If you look at 2 Chronicles, let me see if I can't. 2 Chronicles chapter 7 and verse 20. Then I'll uproot them from my land which I gave them, and this is the house which I sanctified for my name. I'll cast out my sight, and I will make it a proverb and a byword among the people. You see that? I will uproot them from my land which I gave them. So God has given them this land, and he calls it again a good land. You can see that many statements such as Leviticus. You can look at where he uses this title and this phrase many times. Leviticus chapter 25 and verse 23. It says, the land shall not be sold permanently, for the land is mine, and you are strangers and sojourners in this land that God has given. It's God's good land, and the land that belongs to God that he gives to Israel. You see that in chapter 19 and verse 5. Now therefore, if you will indeed obey my voice, keep my covenant, then you shall be a special treasure unto me above all the earth is mine, and you shall be a kingdom of priests, a holy nation. For these are the words which you speak to the children of Israel. All these passages go through and talk about this land being God's land. Excuse me, I keep saying his good land. I was reading the wrong passage there. But this land is called God's land. Over and over again, the earth is Lord and the fullness thereof. You can look at Joel, the prophet Joel, Daniel, Hosea, Joel. You can see that in Joel chapter 2, verse 18. And then chapter 3, verse 2, verse 18, the Lord will be jealous for his land. And then chapter 3 and verse 2, and I'll gather all the nations and bring them down to the valley of Jehoshaphat, and I will enter into judgment with them there on account of my people, my heritage, whom they've scattered among the nations. They've also divided up my land. God is going to come upon the people because of what they have done to his land. So again, it's not the Palestinians' land, it is God's land. The earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof. So that's what we're talking about here. And then again, it's called the good land. And we see that in many passages as well. In Deuteronomy chapter 8, we see it in verse 7, where he says, for the Lord your God is bringing you into a good land, a land of brooks and water, fountains and springs that flow out of valleys and hills. You'll see the same thing in Exodus chapter 3 and verse 8. And these, I'm just trying to give you a couple passages to think about if you want to get more into looking at this and studying it. But in Exodus chapter 3 and verse 8, I've come down to deliver them out of the hand of the Egyptians, to bring them up from the land to a good and large land. And here's the next phrase that he calls the land, to a land flowing with milk and honey. And that's letter C, a land flowing with milk and honey. And of course, you'll see all the verses there, Exodus 13, Exodus 33, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. You see that on letter C up there, the land that flows with milk and honey, Deuteronomy, and various passages in Jeremiah. So again, it's a land that flows with milk and honey. In other words, it's a prosperous land. Milk comes from cattle and goats, and honey is, again, a symbol of pleasure and abundance. And so that's what he's saying. It's a good land. It's God's land. It's a land that flows with milk and honey, and it's not the land of Palestine. This is very important that you understand this. The land that's called Palestine came from the Emperor Hadrian after the Second Jewish Revolt under Bar Kokhba in 132 to 135. It's a derogatory term. In other words, the Philistines were always at war with Israel. And so what Hadrian did was, to try to diminish that they had ever existed, he just totally denied that they were there and called it the land of Palestine. You see that? So that is a term that is not biblical. That's a term from pagan culture. That's where you get that. So it's the land of Canaan. It's the land of Israel. So again, if you're looking at number 4 there, and you can see it says the land unconditionally sworn, promised, and oathed to Israel. And remember, we went through all those passages. We looked at how God swore it to them, how it is the promised land that he gave to them, to Israel, through the unconditional Abrahamic covenant, which God bound himself to keep. Now, something that's important, and I'm not really sure why people keep using this verse. So look at Galatians chapter 3. And again, remember, you have the various covenants, and I know we haven't gotten to the Mosaic covenant, but look at Galatians chapter 3, verses 17 and 18. And he's going to show you the superiority of the promise given to Abraham over the law. You see that? Because some people say, oh, the law canceled them out. They couldn't keep the law, so God kicked them out. And then he turned to the church, and the church is the fullness thereof. But that's not what the Bible teaches you. Do you understand? Do you understand that? The Bible doesn't teach you that. Look at Galatians chapter 3, verses 17 and 18. And this I say, that the law, and of course the law came from Moses, which was 430 years later, cannot annul the covenant that was confirmed before by God in Christ, that it should make the promise of no effect. For if the inheritance is of the law, it is no longer of promise, but God gave it to Abraham by promise. In other words, the law does not cancel out the promise. You see that? God promised the land to Abraham. He extended that promise throughout. It was unconditional, but their enjoyment of it is based on their obedience. And that's necessary that you understand that, and we'll see why. Okay? And then, of course, you see the same thing in Hebrews chapter 6, verse 13, where God pleads himself. And I want to read this again for you so that maybe you get it. Look at it one more time, Hebrews chapter 6. And let me just, if you've not been here again, let me point this out to you. If you're looking at verses 13 through 17, God will use the word promise and swore and oath. And notice what he says, for when God made a promise to Abraham, because he could swear by no greater, he swore by himself. Now, of course, to us, this doesn't mean a lot. But back then, you remember when David fought Goliath? And Goliath said, I swear by the pagan gods, I'll take your head off and all this. He was swearing by someone greater than him. And that's how they did it back then. And so that's what he's saying here. There is no one greater than God. And since God couldn't swear by anybody greater than himself, he swore by himself. He bound himself to fulfill these obligations, saying, surely I will bless you, multiply, and I'll multiply you. And so, after he had patiently endured, he obtained the promise. For men indeed swear by the greater, and an oath for confirmation is for them an end of all dispute. Thus God, determining to show more abundantly to the heirs of promise the immutability or unchangeability of his counsel, confirmed it by an oath, that by two impossible things, remember now, God promised Abraham in chapter 12, he covenanted with him, and God cannot lie, in which it is impossible for God to lie, we might have strong consolation who have fled for refuge to lay hold of the hope that is set before us. God said, I have promised it to him, I have covenanted that with him, and I alone went through the covenant. I put him in a deep sleep, so that all the promises were put on me to fulfill in order for them to have these things. You see that? So the law does not change. Remember that in Jeremiah 31, verses 36 and 7. God said, regardless of what Israel does, unless you can change the sun, moon, stars, and sky, you can't get rid of Israel. I'm not sure if you realize that, or maybe you aren't sure of that passage, but let me just read it for you real quick before we get into the next section, which may be a little bit difficult. But look at Jeremiah, is it 36? What passage is that? Do you guys remember? I'll test your memory. Or is it 31? All right. Chapter 31. There you go. And notice twice in verse 35 and 36, he mentions the ordinances. And he's going to tell you what he means. So, thus says Yahweh, who gives the sun for a light by day, the ordinances of the moon and the stars for a light by night, who disturbs the sea and its waves roar. The Yahweh of hosts is his name. If those ordinances, the sun, the moon, the stars, if those ordinances depart from before me, says Yahweh, then the seed of Israel shall also cease from being a nation from before me. Thus says the Lord, if heaven above can be measured, the foundations of the earth searched out, I will also cast off all the seed of Israel for all they have done. You see that? God is not done with Israel. God has a future for Israel outside of the church, and that's what we're looking at. Now, remember that when we're talking, and I'm trying to bring to your memory these things, when we're talking, these covenants are literal. Excuse me. When we're talking, these covenants that we talked about, they're literal, they're eternal, they're dependent upon God, and they're primarily with Israel. Now, even in Islam's Quran, the Surah 5, verses 20 and 21 says this: when Moses said to his people, "O my people, remember God's blessing upon you when he placed prophets among you and made you kings and gave you what he never gave any other people. O my people, enter the holy land which God has assigned you, and do not turn back lest you return as losers." So even in the surah, the land is given to Israel. Now you say, but yeah, Jeff, in AD 70, they were scattered throughout the earth, right? And what happens is when you start mixing Greek philosophy with Christianity, you get these perspectives on people. So from AD 70 to 1947, there is no Israel. So everybody said, there's no Israel. The church is the fullness of Israel until 1948. And then in 1948, here comes the Jews. We're a nation. Now you realize they've had several wars. The 1967 war, the Yom Kippur War, all these wars that they've had where people have tried to push them into the sea. That's where you get that phrase, from the River Jordan into the sea. That phrase is saying, let's push Israel into the sea. That's what it's saying, you see. And that's their philosophy. So even though they would be scattered throughout the world because of their disobedience. Now we knew that because the Bible teaches that. Look at Deuteronomy. And I'll just give you a couple passages here. Deuteronomy chapter 4 is a good verse to look at, in verse 27, and then we'll look at a couple others. Deuteronomy 4, verse 27. And I realize I don't have those on there. So the problem with studying is, well, for me, it may not be for other people, but I tend to be real wordy. And so sometimes when I'm going back over my notes, I keep adding things, which I shouldn't do. And confusing Megan, who types all that stuff. So Deuteronomy chapter 4, and notice verse 27 of chapter 4. And the Lord will scatter you among the peoples, and you will be left few in number among the nations where the Lord drives you. He says the same thing in Deuteronomy chapter 28, verses 63 to 68. You see the same thing in Leviticus 26, which are the covenant stipulations. Remember that? Well, we don't have that on there. That's the other covenant, the Mosaic covenant. You see it in Ezekiel 22 and Jeremiah 9:16. In chapter 30, when we're talking about the land promise again, look at chapter 30, or just listen in verse 3, that Yahweh your God will bring you back from captivity, have compassion on you, gather you again from all the nations, and notice what it says, where Yahweh your God scattered you, right? Now, they possess the land, or they possess the land unconditionally based on God, right? But they're not enjoying it. They're not enjoying it because they have to be perfect and comply to the Mosaic law. Now, do you see the problem with that so far? Remember, back in Exodus chapter 19, when God is giving them the law, and go back there and just kind of a reminder, in Exodus chapter 19, and notice verses 7 and 8 of Exodus chapter 19. And there's other passages that go along with this. Chapter 24, verses 3 and 7. When you go back to the second time he's given the law in Deuteronomy 5, it's the same. You'll see the same phraseology there. So Exodus chapter 19, verses 7 and 8 So Moses came, called for the elders of the people, laid before them all the words which the Lord commanded. Then all the people, and here's the problem, all the people answered and said, all that Yahweh has spoken, we will do. Bad move, right? How many ever tried to live the perfect Christian life every day? Yeah, see, you're laughing already, you know, right? And so what happens as a result of that? What happens as a result of that is they're deported. Look at Jeremiah 25. And again, I'm just giving you things to wrap your mind around, things that you can look at later. But look at Jeremiah chapter 25. And again, I apologize if I am going too fast because I never feel as though I have enough time. But notice verses 8 through 11 here in Jeremiah chapter 25. Verse 8, therefore thus saith Yahweh of hosts, because you have not heard my words, which you said you would do them, behold, I will send and take all the families of the north, says Yahweh, and Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, my servant. Again, this is a pagan king. I will bring them against this land, against its inhabitants, against the nations all around, and I will utterly destroy them and make them an astonishment, a hissing, a perpetual desolation. Moreover, I'll take from them the voice of mirth and gladness, the bridegroom, the bride, the sound of millstone, the light of the lamp. And this whole land shall be a desolation and astonishment, and these nations shall serve the king of Babylon 70 years. So they're deported for the 70-year captivity. All because they had said, all that the Lord has said, we will do. Now, I realize that some people say, well, you know, you're saying that God had promised the land to Israel, and so it's probably not that much. It's probably just a little bit. I'm not going to read the passages that I have here, but I have 7 pages, 170 verses, and when I'm looking at these, all of these are land promises to Israel. 170. Now, you could look at the earlier ones and say, oh, God probably fulfilled them. But you can get up to passages like Amos chapter 9 and verse 15, where he says, I will plant Israel in their land, never again to be uprooted from the land I give them, says the Lord God. You see the same thing in Acts chapter 7 and verse 5. He says, he gave him no inheritance here, not even a foot of ground, but God promised him that he and his seed after him would possess the land, even though at that time Abraham had no children. That's Acts chapter 7, verse 5. And then in chapter 3, verse 19, he overthrew 7 nations in Canaan and gave their land to his people as their inheritance. 7 pages, or 6 pages, 170 verses of God promising the land to Israel. Past, present, and future. Yes. Yes.
Okay, so since all of us know that none of us can obey the law, how did they ever?
I was so hoping one of you would ask that question. I have a list of questions that I ask in response to everything I say. And that was one of them I have highlighted because I was hoping somebody would ask that. And the question is this: it seems impossible. God is saying, listen, here's an unconditional promise. You have the land. But you have to be absolutely perfect to get the land and enjoy the land. So how do they do that?
I mean, in my thought process, I'm thinking that is why these things get fulfilled in Christ. Because it's only through Christ that he fulfilled that as the seed.
That he fulfilled what?
Christ fulfills the law. So he is the seed that brings the blessing. And Israel and the church, everyone that believes and is covered by Christ, also inherits, because he's the forerunner and he's the first fruit, and he can actually, am I totally like?
Well, what did you just say? How do they inherit the land then? So what was your question again? Well, I'm saying, think about what we're talking about here. And this, again, this goes right back to what I was saying earlier as far as what your thinking is. We're teaching.
Thinking is further lower on the page from the map, not teaching.
Yes,
Why I'm trying to understand the other sides and how it all could work together.
good, good. Did you hear what she said? She said her viewpoint is a more of a covenant viewpoint, which means the church is fulfilled in Israel and there is no future for these things.
Well, I don't think there's no future for them. It's just that,
By themselves.
right, it's through Christ.
Yes, but by themselves. Remember, your question is, how do they get into there? How do they get into there? What is one of the promises? What's one of the promises? A blessing. What's the blessing? Come on, help me out. I know some of you are listening. What is the blessing? It's a new heart. I'll take out your heart of stone. I'll give you the heart of flesh. When I do that, you will obey me. Look at Ezekiel 11. And just remember, keep this in mind because, and this is such a good point. I'm so glad that you brought this out because we don't really think about this. But if you think about it and you keep it in the context, as it's given, you'll see very clearly what's going on, right? And I probably won't be able to find the passage. Do you know where it is, the new covenant in Ezekiel? Is it 11? 19? Did you say it's chapter 19? Oh, you got me again. Okay. Is that right? Okay. All right. Chapter 11. You there? Chapter 11 of book of Ezekiel. Chapter 11, verses 19 and 20. He is not talking to the church. There is no church. He's talking to Israel. Remember, there are a mixed multitude that come out with Israel of Egypt, and there are sporadic promises to the Gentiles in Isaiah of a future remnant of Gentiles coming in. But here he's dealing primarily with Israel, who is his covenant people, right? And in Ezekiel 11, that's what he's saying here. Then I will give them one heart. I will put a new spirit in them. I'll take the stony heart of flesh. I'll give them. And give them a heart. And take the stony heart out of their flesh and give them a heart of flesh, that they may walk in my statutes and my judgments and do them. They shall be my people. I will be their God. How do they enjoy the promised land? Because they're regenerate. Why are they regenerate? Because Christ fulfilled the means. You see that? Were they dispersed? Yes, but God said they would be dispersed. Would they come back? Yes, God brought them back. Just like they were literally dispersed, he literally brought them back. Upon whose work? Their work? No, Christ's work. Right? Good question. I was waiting for somebody to ask that. Zach? I will repeat it if you help me remember to repeat it because the mics are kind of crackling. You're going to have to condense that so I can condense it because I can't repeat all that. I hated to let you ramble on, but I was trying to listen where you were going. What's inoculate? Okay. Say it again now. No, just start over. I know you guys don't want me using the vocabulary I read, so I try to talk as plain as I can. Good. And so that's what Shannon was saying. That's what her view was, which if that's your view, it depends on what your perspective is. You know, are you historic premillennial? Are you postmillennial? Are you amillennial? What are you? Because if you are one of those things and you're reading people like MacArthur and Ryrie and all them, you're going to be very confused. That's the whole point of me bringing this up, is to help you know who to read, how to study. If you want to be a postmillennial, that's great. If you want to be amillennial, that's great. But I simply want you to understand that the things that you think about and the people that you read, you're either going to get clarity or confusion. So that's the whole point of me letting you understand this, right? So if you believe that Israel has replaced the church, then you still have to find out where you're going to put those issues. Especially because you say you're premillennial. Because if you're premillennial in the amillennial scheme, you're in the millennial kingdom now. It's not future. It's now. Which means, what happened to the tribulation? What happened to the wrath of God? What happened to the temple? You see what I'm saying? You have those issues you have to deal with now. Right? So that's my point, to get you to think about who you're reading, what you're studying, what you believe, and why. Okay? Any other thoughts on that? Right? Now remember, when we're talking about the kingdom, this seems to confuse people. And so I thought I would throw this up there to again remind you of it. And we probably won't get too much further than this. But people talk about the two kingdom age and they try to get into all that. You have the universal kingdom of God, which means God has always been the king overall, will always be the king overall. Always has been, always will be. You have God's number two, you have God's theocratic kingdom and his messianic kingdom, which is basically God and his bride is ruling over God's creation for God. So when you look at the messianic kingdom, Jesus fled this world to receive a literal kingdom. When he returns, he will set up this universal kingdom. God promised David that he would establish his kingdom forever and later confirmed it with an oath. The angel Gabriel declared that Jesus was the heir to this throne and that this kingdom would fill the whole earth, that Jerusalem would be the capital city, that all nations would come to worship, and that it would be characterized by peace and righteousness. And then you have two spiritual kingdoms. And those two spiritual kingdoms are number 3 and number 5. The spiritual kingdom that we're all born into is Satan's kingdom. We are dead in our trespasses and sins. The other kingdom is the kingdom of God in which you are born into. See that? Only those people who are regenerated, born again, will enter into that messianic kingdom. Maybe. I think so. But some say no. And that's what we'll look at again. Are you with me so far? Kinda? A little bit? All right. Any other thoughts on that? No other questions? Comments? Yeah. That's all right. I'll word it, and you'll sound so smart when I'm done rewording it. Yes. Now make it real short so I can reword it. Come on, help me. This is part of. Oh. I say that all the time, and my wife is sitting here going like this all the time. No, you didn't.
So really, the land promise, is it for all of it? I mean, we get confused on this issue. We're talking here about believing Jews in the end will believe in Christ.
Yes.
And
That's the Matthew 25, the remnant that goes in to the kingdom prepared for them before the foundations of the world.
but I think that's where we get tripped up.
Well,
Well, God's promise is all Israel.
yep.
We have Jews out there doing stupid stuff and destructive stuff.
Yes. Yes. But they're still God's chosen people, and you have to understand that. Okay? Listen to Ezekiel 38, verses 8 and 9. It'll come to pass in all the land, says Yahweh, that 2/3 in it will be cut off and die, and 1/3 will be left in it. And I'll bring that third, that's your remnant, through the fire, refine them as silver is refined, test them as gold is tested, and they'll call upon my name. You have it in Amos chapter 9, verse 11. I'll raise up the tabernacle of David, or verse 10, 9 and 10 of Amos. For surely I will command, I will sift the house of Israel among all nations, as grain is sifted in the sieve, yet not the smallest ground will fall. All the sinners of my people, that is Israel, will die by the sword. See that? So he is going to weed out, and you can see that in Ezekiel 20, verses 33 to 38 as well, where God weeds out the unbelieving remnant. Matthew chapter 25, again, the same thing. When you get into the New Testament, I realize that's going way ahead of our study. But in Matthew 25, that's again what he is saying here. Well, in verse 34, he says, then the king will say to those on his right hand, come, blessed of my Father, inherit the kingdom prepared for you from before the foundation of the world. You see? Yeah, Shannon. Which viewpoint? Okay. Remember the things that we went over and talked about that Israel was chosen for? Do you remember that? Bring us this. The three main things that Israel was chosen to do was to give us what? The Bible. What else? The Messiah. And what else? The kingdom. Those are the three main things. And you don't get them by being good. They come through Israel. By the work of the Messiah, the true Israel. See that? Yeah. Yeah. Remember, we went over this. I went over all this information with you. And I didn't do that to put you to sleep. I did that to help you study. There are various senses in which people are called and chosen. Judas was called to be a disciple. Was he saved or not saved? Now, wait a minute. He was chosen. What about the priests who defiled the tabernacle and all that? Eli's sons, were they saved or not saved? See that?